very good to have this opportunity to speak. The last time we spoke to each other was amidst not exactly a raucous, but quite an assembly for the VE Day dinner in Stationers' Hall. One of the last things, actually, I think, before we had to shut the hall. It was a good affair, wasn't it?
It was a very good affair, very lively, and I was wondering whether it was actually the last event.
I think pretty well it was, yes. Anyway, to move on, and I suppose the thing I was going to ask you first of all is, I'm actually interviewing you in France, but where are you from originally, as it were?
I'm a Londoner. I was
right. Central London?
North London.
Oh, yes. And which part?
Enfield. I went to Enfield Grammar School, one of the old grammar schools.
I know it very well because I spent my childhood in Enfield, well, and used to
indeed,
and commuted to Stationers' School in Hornsey from Enfield. So,
well, certainly our school used to play the old Stationers' School at football from time to time. I seem to remember.
Yeah,
not far away.
And then after that, you went to Cambridge. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, I went to Cambridge. I read modern languages there, French and German, and.
Which college were you?
I was at Clare. Clare College.
Clare College, yeah, right. Yeah. And modern languages clearly were a very good starting point for much, I think, of what we'll talk about later. Because once you left Cambridge, you went straight to Reuters?
I did, yes. It was all very unplanned and unexpected in the sense that I had opted to do my national service, my military service, after Cambridge. And in those days, as many of the livery will remember, national service lasted for 2 years. It was only in my third year at Cambridge that national service was abolished. So I thought that I had been given a 2-year holiday by the government and that I didn't need to look for a job. The university thought otherwise, and the appointments board said, we must arrange some interviews for you to get a job. And I'd heard of Reuters. I didn't know much about it. I had a vague idea I wanted to be an international journalist, but it was very vague. And I said, get me an interview with Reuters. They did, and I was accepted, and I joined the company.
And now when I was the rector of St. Michael's Cornhill, not very long ago, if I was going across from St. Michael's to the Bank of England, so I'd go around the back of the Royal Exchange, and I walked past, I think I'm right in saying, I walked past the statue of Paul Julius Reuter, who was your founder, yes?
Indeed, yes. Our founder was actually an immigrant from Germany, German-born, started in the business of information in Paris, working with Havas, and he realized that information could be worth a lot of money if it was delivered quickly, accurately to the right people. And he set up his own first independent operation in Brussels using pigeons. It wasn't exactly the latest technology even then, but he used it to great effect to fly the information that he had, which was mainly stocks and shares and some odd political stories, from Brussels to Aachen, where there was the end of the German telegraph. And the telegraph then picked up speed and took the messages on to Berlin, to the stock exchange and the bankers in Berlin. And that was the origin of Reuters. Later, he moved to London.
What made him come to London, do we know?
Well, first of all, the telegraph was linked up between Brussels and Aachen, so he was out of business. And secondly, an undersea cable was laid between London and the continent. And he thought this was a business opportunity. So he moved to London, set up his first office where that statue is at Royal Exchange. And he then began selling information of all kinds, but mainly economic and financial, with some major political events that affected the markets. And that's how he built a worldwide empire of news and information.
And perhaps you could say a bit more about that, because I'm assuming that things like Associated Press are not dissimilar to Reuters. And why would a newspaper or television channel, why would they come to Reuters rather than have their own correspondents?
Well, first of all, no single newspaper or radio or later television could afford to have the network that the agencies offered in terms of correspondence all over the world and communications, very fast, reliable communications all over the world. So what the big agencies were doing was offering scaled up communications for all kinds of customers. We were offering news, general news, political news, but also very specialized news in the fields of stock markets, commodity markets, and later money markets. And all that was provided at a price which no single newspaper could have afforded to pay.
Yes, I see. And actually, you've now brought us into another area of interest, because looking back on your career, some of those specialized things were areas that eventually you found yourself covering. But before that, you were a foreign correspondent in, well, numerous parts of Europe, but also much more widely than that.
Yes, I went on a first 1-year training assignment to Geneva. But after that, Reuters sent me to some very much more newsworthy places than Geneva was at the time. And ironically, I'd avoided British military service, but then found myself sent out by Reuters to cover a whole series of war zones. And I saw more active combat than I would ever have seen, I think, in the British Army at that stage. I was in the Congo, first of all, in Katanga during the big United Nations operation involving the secession of a large part of the Congo. Lots of activity involving mercenaries and boys' own paper stuff. And the Zanzibar Revolution in Africa, also a very colourful, rather brutal story. I was 3 years in Africa. After that, I went to Paris just in time for the 1968, this dates me, the 1968 uprising against de Gaulle, the troubles which we celebrated the 50th anniversary a year or so ago in Paris. And then I was sent out to Vietnam. I was bureau chief in Saigon during the American War for a year or so. And later on, after a brief stay back in London, as brief as I could make it, I was sent to the Middle East. And I spent 5 years based in Beirut during a time of, at the beginning, it was a beautiful place to be. It was the Paris of the East, and we had a wonderful time. But then, of course, it broke down into, first of all, the Arab-Israeli war, and then a civil war, and it became a very unpleasant place. So that was my early introduction to journalism.
And when you were in Congo, was that the same time that Dag Hammarskjöld was out there and eventually was died in an aeroplane crash?
Yes, that was. He'd actually been killed just before I arrived. A colleague of mine, colleagues of mine in both what was then Leopoldville and Elizabethville were involved in covering that story. I went out soon afterwards, and that was when the fighting developed in the whole of that eastern part of the Congo, involving white mercenaries, black militia, and the United Nations from a whole range of different countries. It was a very complex situation. I think it was the UN operation ever mounted of a peacekeeping nature.
And then moving on in your career a bit, thereafter, you became more specialized. I think I'm right in saying you did some business management reporting and also corporate social responsibility. Is that right? That's
right. I was not very willingly persuaded into general management within Reuters, which at the beginning was a huge challenge because I didn't consider myself a manager. But it was very challenging. But I enjoyed it immensely because it was a whole new career. It was like literally joining a new company. But it was a company that was expanding very fast, was very successful. And I was manager in succession in France, where I had previously been a journalist as news editor and a reporter. Later on, I was in charge of areas of the Middle East, of Africa and Asia. And then finally, I was manager of the UK, which sort of brought me back home after many years abroad.
And after you've been retired just for a little while now, and during that time, you've done some fascinating things. One of the things you mentioned is journaliste en Europe. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes, that was a long-standing program to bring early to mid-career journalists to Paris, where it was based, to learn about the European Union. It was specifically geared to explaining what the European Union was all about and sending these journalists out on reporting assignments in 2 or even 3-man teams. And the job of there was an editor-in-chief of the service based in Paris, a Frenchman, who was excellent. And he and I, as chairman, used to look at the assignments and hand them out to the journalists and then look at the results when they came back. It was very much a hands-on practical reporting course. And
how did, in your retirement, it's early on in your retirement, you became a stationer. How did that happen? What hooked you into the stationers?
The clerk of the time, Brigadier Denzil Sharp.
Yes, yes.
A very persuasive man, you may know. I found myself sitting next to him at a lunch of the Journalist Charity, of which I was a trustee in my retirement, a very old established journalists charity. And we used to have an annual lunch, and we would invite guests from the media and so on. And the guest I was assigned to sit next to was Denzil Sharp. And he sold me on becoming a member, a liveryman, in a very blunt sort of way. He said, you're a journalist, you'll fit in, absolutely. I have to tell you, you'll never be master. Too old. So I said, that's all right, I have no intention of becoming master if I join. So he recruited me effectively. And I joined thinking that the stationers, which I knew to some extent because I'd been manager for Reuters and we'd used Stationers' Hall for functions and so on. But I just thought that being a liveryman was joining a kind of relaxed dining club. And that was my impression at first, but it didn't last.
No, and perhaps that brings us on to, before we finish our conversation, I think the thing that people will know you most for, although you're always very reticent in the way you present yourself in it, is as editor of the Stationers' News. Perhaps you'd like to say a bit about that, because I think people would be fascinated.
Is that was a kind of rude awakening from my assumption of general dining in the club, in the company, I should say. I thought it was a club. What happened was that Denzil Sharp called me up one day and said, "Stephen, you're a journalist." "Yes," I said cautiously. He said, "I need a journalist. I need a new editor for Stationers' News. I've just sacked the existing editor. Couldn't spell." So I said, yes. He said, "I imagine it's exactly the sort of thing that you could do. Could you come in and see me maybe tomorrow, possibly? Sandwich in the office?" So I went in, had a sandwich, military style, and he asked me to become editor of Stationers' News. And I agreed tentatively for 1 year. And here I am 13 years later, still doing it.
And we're all very grateful. I think, I always find it's beautifully laid out, often with good images in it. And you seem to have coaxed out of people good writing without having to tell them to do so. And even the spelling's correct, isn't it?
I think it is, yes. It's a bit like a local newspaper. Everybody knows everybody and everything. And they certainly know the spelling of the names. And they would certainly tell me if I got anything serious or not so serious wrong. And so far, one of the previous editors, when I took up the job, he said, I'll be waiting in the wings, looking for the howlers. And I said, well, I'll offer you a bottle of good champagne if you can spot a howler in my first 3 months. I didn't have to give it to him. But what did happen was that I took over a job in journalism of a kind that I knew nothing about, because my journalistic career was as a news agency man. Now, news agencies supply raw material. Well, we don't think it's raw, but it is raw to them, to newspapers, who then do what they like with it and publish it if they wish. And they're the people who do the layout and the matching illustrations and deciding what to put in and what not. Now, I hadn't done that. So this was journalism, but not as I had ever known it. And it's been fascinating.
Well, and it's marvellous. And I think probably we will need to draw things to a close, but I do so with a little tiny sense of envy, because I can see you sitting there in the sunshine on the Atlantic coast of France, and I'm afraid the weather back here is not quite the same. Stephen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been good to talk. Thank you.